This short video is going to describe the financial portion of the basic setup page. On the basic setup page, the participant will be asked to place value on the items that they own when they begin the SAE. Now, the assets, or the things that are owned, are broken into two categories: current assets and non-current. The difference between the two is really quite simple. A current asset is anything that the project owns that will be sold or used within the coming year. Non-current assets are anything that the project owns that are used in the project but have a useful life more than a year. So let's start with each category. In current assets, we've got four different line items. Line item one is investment in harvesting and growing crops. So how do you place a value? Well, there's a difference now between harvested crops and growing crops. If you have a harvested crop, and so you have a corn crop, let's say, and it's actually been harvested and it's in storage, then you estimate the value of that crop as of the date you're entering the SAE. In other words, the beginning date. It would be like having corn at the elevator. You could just simply pick the phone up, call the elevator, and say, what could I sell my corn for today? Now, growing crop is a little bit different. You cannot estimate the future yield of that crop and what it might sell for. So how do you put a value on it? And the conventional way is to simply sum the expenses that you've had for that crop from the beginning until the current date. So if you had a wheat crop growing at the end of the year and you were doing this value at the end of the year, you would simply go back to the date that crop was started and you would summarize the expenses you've spent on it until the current date. And that's the value that you would put in this box. Okay, investment in feed, seed, fertilizer, chemical, etc. These items are typically the operating expenses of the day-to-day operation of the SAE. But these are items that are on hand at the beginning date. It would be an example of an inventory of feed. Yeah, you might have diesel in a storage tank. Anything that you use on that farm on a day-to-day basis and is going to be used in the next year, and you have it in inventory at the beginning date, needs a value. The value here should not be what you think it would sell for, because that's not what you're going to do. You have no intention of selling these items. So the value here should be what you paid for them. Line item 3, investment in merchandise, crops, and animals purchased for resale. Sometimes the SAE goes and purchases items and then adds value to them and resells them. A great example is a stocker operation where you would buy steers, put them on pasture for a while, and simply turn around and resell them. Well, if at the beginning of the date of the SAE, if any of those are owned, they're going to be sold later. They should be valued at what they could be sold for at that date. So if you had some steers, for example, that you had purchased and they're in the program at the beginning date, you should simply value those at what they could be sold at whatever sale location you might use. Investment in raised market livestock and poultry. Essentially, this is the same thing. If in a livestock operation, if you have animals that have been raised on in the project to be sold, they just haven't been sold yet, then they should be valued at what they could be sold for on that date. For items 3 and 4, if we were talking about animals, and for example cattle, and the typical way you sell those cattle is with a local auction sale, then these values simply should be those most recent auction values. Of course, if it's other types of items, they would have other ways in which they're sold, but it should be what those items could be sold for at the date of this beginning, not a projected sale later. If you had a show steer and he was going to go to show in February or March of the next year, but yet you're setting value in December, you do not project what you think that animal will be worth. It's simply what is the typical way you could sell it right now. And if that was just a local auction sale, then that should be the way you value that item. Non-current assets have to do with two distinct categories: things that are depreciable, which means they have a determinable life, and things that are not depreciable, which means they do not have a determinable life, which typically is land. Let's look at the different items. Investment in non-depreciable draft, pleasure, and breeding animals. Well, what this means is this is breeding animals in a livestock operation that have been raised on the farm or raised on in the project. Non-depreciable breeding animals are animals that have been raised. If you purchased them, they had a purchase price, they should be depreciated. We're going to talk more in another video how to place value here, so I'm going to skip that one for a moment, but be sure and watch the other short video on how you would place value on raised breeding animals. In line item B, this is investment in depreciable draft, pleasure, and breeding animals. Well, simply the word depreciable simply means you bought them. So what happens is this value should be an undepreciated amount of that animal. So what does that mean? Well, let's suppose 3 years ago you bought a herd bull and you bought him for $3,000. And just for some reason you're depreciating him at $300 a year. Well, if you bought him 3 years ago and your depreciation is $300 a year, you have claimed $900 worth of depreciation. So he should go on the value in this box at $2,100. You should never value those animals at market value. It's not what they could be sold for. It's their original purchase price minus depreciation that you either claimed or should have claimed during the time you've owned them. So you would calculate the amount of depreciation from the date of purchase until the date that you're valuing them and subtract that depreciation from the original purchase price. Now that same concept is for C&D. If for machinery and equipment that's depreciable, it's exactly the same concept. It should be the original purchase price minus any depreciation that you should have claimed over the time period that you owned it. Now land's a little different. Land doesn't depreciate because it does not have a determinable life. Investment in land in this box should always be the original purchase price. You do not inflate the value of land. And the land value should sit there. If you purchased it 3 years ago for $2,000 an acre, it still should be sitting there at $2,000, and it should stay at $2,000 all through the years of the SAE. You should never increase that value. In other words, appreciate the land value. This will help you to understand these two categories. Of course, there's a lot of unusual SAE projects out there, but just remember, current assets are things that are going to be sold or used within a short time period, typically 1 year, and they should be valued maybe at their current market value if they're going to be sold, or what they were purchased for if it's an inventory of supplies. Non-current assets are typically either depreciable assets or non-depreciable, which is land. The depreciable assets should always be at what you purchased them for minus what you should have claimed as depreciation, and land should always be at its original purchase price. The real deviation here is this non-depreciable purchase breeding stock, which we will devote a video to that item by itself.